Good morning, it's Mark Davis, and we wanted to spend a little bit of time and shoot a video that provides a general overview of the revised Policy 212 that deals with vehicle collision and investigation. So it is a revision of an existing policy. It's always good time to time to update policies, make them current. Sometimes we find things that need to change for the better of the organization, and that was the case here. Clearly, driving and operating fire department vehicles presents a huge liability to not only the driver, but the corporation itself and everybody's assets. So it is important to have a good policy that addresses what happens when a vehicle collision or an incident involving a vehicle occurs. And that was the premise behind revising this. Probably the thing you'll find the greatest change in the policy revision is that post-collision drug and alcohol testing is no longer an absolute requirement for every collision and incident involving a vehicle owned, rented, or borrowed by the fire department. So that's a good thing. We recognize from time to time collisions are the fault of other folks, and we can get units back in service and drivers back with their driving status faster. So that was probably one of the leading changes or leading factors that drove the change. So the purpose is to have a process by which to investigate and report all collisions and incidents involving apparatus. The applicability applies to everybody who works for or volunteers at the Winfield Community Volunteer Fire Department. Background is, right, it's a revision to an existing policy. A few of the terms, you'll be able to go through these yourself in the policy. Personnel, that again is everybody who works, whether you're full-time or part-time, and anybody who is a member of the volunteer fire department in accordance with the department's bylaws. Line officer is strictly right out of the bylaws. So that is going to be all the folks that are listed in the bylaws. So that is the fire chief, the assistant chief, any fire lieutenants, fire captain, EMS captain, and EMS lieutenants. We did not list a safety officer because there is no requirement to have one, and we didn't want to hamstring the policy by having a position that may not be filled, having responsibility in the overall process. Doesn't mean that if a safety officer exists that they can't be used, but we didn't want to tie the policy up with a position that is not necessarily required by the bylaws. Duty officer, right? So the duty officer is a rostered line officer. What does that mean? That means when you look at the website for the duty officer schedule, there is a person's name there and they are on duty. The duty officer speaks for the fire chief at the time, right? That is the person who has operational authority for the fire department, operationally wise, right? And basically assumes that role as the duty officer. So when we speak about rostered, you find the rostered duty officer by looking at the website in the calendar under duty officer. If there is no rostered duty officer, then of course the fire chief and the EMS captain, they are the folks with the authority in this policy. Unit officer. The unit officer is the person in charge of the unit. Absent a line officer, the unit officer is the person who rides the right front seat of that vehicle. Doesn't matter if it's utility 14, if it's the tanker, if it's engine 141, that doesn't matter. It is the unit officer. In most all cases, the driver cannot be the unit officer unless the driver is by themselves. Driver is pretty clear. That's anybody that drives and operates and authorized to do so according to the policy for driver certification. Apparatus is any vehicle owned, operated by the fire department, and that could be on an ownership basis, that could be reserve apparatus, that could be something that we lease, that could be something on loan from another fire department. A collision is basically when two vehicles strike each other, or when a vehicle strikes an object. Say a unit hits a mailbox, that's a collision. Say two units strike each other or two vehicles strike each other, that's a collision. An incident is something involving the vehicle that didn't necessarily result in collision to another vehicle or necessarily damage to another private property, but maybe to the fire truck. Example, you lose a load of hose and the hose gets all damaged, but it didn't strike anything else. That would be an incident. And then we have a person called the collision incident investigator. That's the person assigned by the fire chief or EMS captain at the time of the event, who is going to come in and they are going to ensure that the policy checklist is completed. Let's talk about the policy. Policy is, hey, everything gets investigated. Every motor vehicle collision gets investigated by law enforcement personnel. They're the folks trained in looking at all motor vehicle collisions, and that's why we want them involved in every collision. Every collision is going to have a Maryland Motor Vehicle Accident Report. You get that from law enforcement. Post-collision testing will be required anytime there's an injury, anytime fire department vehicle has to be towed, and anytime the damage results in the fire department vehicle being placed out of service. What does that mean? It means out of service, no longer available to run calls, and maybe having to be replaced with a reserve, or simply being placed out of service for repair, right? Can't come back in until it's repaired. That does not mean that you put the unit out of service and drive it back to the firehouse at nighttime so you can look at it closer. That doesn't mean that. That would mean, though, you brought it back to the firehouse, you looked at it and say, well, it's just going to have to stay out of service. So that's the three criteria. Every time there's a collision, driver status is automatically suspended until folks get back to the firehouse and we can sort everything out, right? And then at the end, there will be a disposition that's given. It's a written document. It's released by the fire chief and EMS captain regarding the disposition of the event. Responsibilities. Obviously, we have a responsibility to report the incident to ECC, let folks know about it, let the fire chief know, get help on the way, stop, render care, provide statements once you get back. Fire chief, EMS captain, they're responsible for ensuring the investigation. Procedure: if you're the unit involved, you got to stop. The unit officer has to check for injuries. They got to notify ECC that they've been involved in a collision. Notify the fire chief and the EMS captain, request law enforcement, and make sure all reports are completed. Remember that an investigator will come from the fire department to help out on that. The unit officer cannot be the investigator. You can continue on a call if it's life-threatening and no injuries have occurred. What's life-threatening? A couple examples. You're going on an unconscious person, you're going on a cardiac arrest, you're going on a vehicle collision with rescue, or you're going on a first due reported structure fire. Again, no injuries, and you can continue. There's more guidelines in the policy that you need to read. We spoke about post-collision testing. If there's injury, if the fire department vehicle has to be towed, or if the fire department vehicle is placed out of service from running calls. Enforcement. In the end, driver status will be restored as soon as possible. That could easily be upon return to the firehouse and once statements are received, or it could be a little bit longer based upon the nature of the severity of the incident and any post-collision testing needed. Any at-fault incident, any at-fault collision or incident is most likely going to result in some remedial training for the driver. That could be something simple, that could be something complex, and could involve discipline. Could be something as simple as a written reprimand to something more severe as termination or suspension of membership based upon the frequency of occurrence with the driver and severity and prevention. So hopefully this is helpful here. A quick overview. You need to read the policy yourself. You will have an email that will have a short quiz on it just to help make sure everybody's good on the parts that they read, and then we'll be good to go. Again, the biggest thing is report everything. Drivers are going to lose their status immediately. Hopefully many of those can be returned pretty darn fast, often by the time you get back to the firehouse and statements are written. And some of the post-collision testing, drug and alcohol testing, have been relaxed so that in those incidents where we clearly are not at fault and damage is relatively minor, then we don't have tied up a driver waiting on results for a couple days. Any questions can be directed to the fire chief or the EMS captain. Thank you.